Welcome to the Living Medicine Podcast, where we talk about ethical medical use of psychedelic psychotherapy, teaching skills, examining the issues, and interviewing interesting people. Now let's start today's show.
Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Sandy Newis of the Living Medicine Institute, and this is the Living Medicine Podcast, where I interview interesting and influential people in the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy space. And Living Medicine Institute is a business where we provide content and resources and training for clinical and medical professionals who are interested in learning about psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy with an emphasis on direct pathways to practice and clinical applications. So we appreciate you coming here and joining us today. And I am very excited to have Ken Weingardt. Is that the right way to say your last name?
Yes, ma'am. You got it.
Great. Good. Good. So Dr. Weingardt is a licensed psychologist and natural medicine facilitator located in Boulder, Colorado. He earned his PhD from University of Washington and has been a professor of psychiatry at Stanford and Northwestern medical schools, and also served in the Departments of Veteran Affairs for nearly 20 years, where he focused on training in evidence-based psychotherapy. Then he went on to work in various startups in the San Francisco area, in the Bay Area, focusing on mental and behavioral health. And what he says is after his own profound psychedelic experience in 2020, he began to shift the focus to natural medicine and moved to Boulder to pursue this passion. And he's currently certified from the Integrative Psychiatry Institute and is director of training and education for the Heroic Hearts Project. So, I also know you as somebody who co-wrote a book with Matt Zeman, who was our last podcast guest, and hasn't come out yet, but everybody stay tuned for that. And you seem to me like a very genuine and down-to-earth and authentic person. So I'm happy to have you here. Is there anything that I missed in your bio that you want to share with people?
No, I think that was a good coverage of my last 10 years anyway. But it's been a busy career with lots of pivots. And I'm really happy that I've landed in the psychedelic space with you and so many other influential people.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like it's been a lot of chapters, and from what I gathered in our talk beforehand, kind of it almost feels like those things are all kind of culminating together for you and where you are right now.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. It's all coming together, as they say.
Good. Well, I know you again because Matt introduced us, and I introduced us because you two co-wrote a book that I was interested in. It was the Psychedelic Guides for Veterans, correct?
Yes, ma'am. The Veterans Guide to Psychedelic Journeys, and we worked together on the coach and therapist edition of that manual.
Good. Great. And so I would love to hear about that as we unfold, but I also really wonder, I generally like to start this, how did you come to be in the psychedelic assisted psychotherapy world, or just the psychedelic world in general? And kind of what keeps you here? This is not the easiest road to hoe. It's a fascinating road to keep on, but what brought you here, and what is it about it that excites you and keeps you here?
Yeah, good question. So, your listeners can't see me, but I am currently bald. I used to be a long-haired Grateful Dead deadhead back in the 80s. So I kind of followed them around the country during my various breaks from high school and college, and it was really a wonderful, vibrant community that I was part of back in those days, and kind of saw them through the end of their first incarnation back in the mid 90s. And this was back when LSD and psilocybin were referred to as drugs as opposed to medicines. So they were kind of used outside of the regulated context. But it really helped me to appreciate the power of psychedelics to foster a sense of connection, belonging, insight, growth, transformation, community, and yes, fun. And so, used in that recreational context, that's kind of my background. So that's always kind of been in the background. I'm interested in jam bands and still kind of do the concert scene, and so that's kind of how I got into it. How I got into the psychedelic assisted therapy piece, you mentioned in my introduction that I had an experience myself going through ketamine assisted therapy, where I really had this profound appreciation of whether I wanted to spend the rest of the third act of my career in making better apps and chatbots to help people kind of tap their way to mental health, or do I want to really pivot and invest the remainder of my career on helping people access psychedelic healing and profound transformation, spiritual awakening, and all these things that we know come from psychedelics. And so, as you mentioned, I kind of voted with my feet and kind of left Silicon Valley, moved to Boulder, started working in the space. I kind of my segue into this space came through an organization called the Psychedelic Science Funders Collaborative, and that's the group of high net worth folks that have funded most of the MAPS MDMA work to date. And so I kind of began working with them with an emphasis. They started an initiative focused on improving veterans' access to MDMA, and that's kind of where that was kind of my first job in the psychedelic space. I stayed there for about 2 years. And your listeners are probably aware of how that story turned out in terms of MDMA and the FDA's ultimate rejection of the Lykos application to do that. And that means that that we, our investment in trying to get MDMA to veterans through the Department of Veterans Affairs doesn't seem like it's moving forward, at least in the short term. So I was working on supporting research projects that are looking at MDMA, both in couples and groups and individual work, PTSD, depression, marital stress. And then we also scoped out a variety of clinical demonstration projects, basically working with the folks in the field who, once MDMA had been approved and had been through some clinical trials to show that it was efficacious under like controlled conditions, what can we do to get MDMA into practice in low resource settings and community-based clinics and federally qualified healthcare centers? And so I'd scoped out a variety of projects along those lines. But again, we kind of got stopped dead in our tracks, as so many people in the field did, by that MDMA kind of FDA rejection. So I kind of since then I've kind of moved into the Heroic Hearts Project, as you mentioned, where I'm the director of training and education. And I'm really excited to be part of that organization. It's just a wonderful group of people doing really transformative work. And we can go into a little more into kind of my role there. But that's kind of, and I have a deep investment in veterans mental health. I spent many years in the VA myself, kind of know my way around the agency. And I've really invested most of my career in trying to improve access to evidence-based mental health services that people actually want to receive, which is often a missing piece in this field, is that, we kind of put forward these treatments and we know that they work, but nobody wants to do them. And half of the people don't get better and half the people drop out. So what are we going to do? Well, we have a powerful new modality of healing, and so anyway, I just kind of jumped in with both feet, and here we are.
Well, along those lines, I assume you're talking about things like prolonged exposure and cognitive processing and things that are evidence-based in the VA and have been shown to be, more effective than other things have been for PTSD. And yet you're alluding to it. And what I also know as a, therapist and a trained researcher, that these things are aversive and the dropout rates are really, really high versus MDMA, where there are almost no dropouts. Like, any thoughts about that?
Yes, I think that what we have identified in psychedelics is a treatment that people actually want to engage in. And they see, to kind of pontificate a bit on like prolonged exposure and CPT, they both kind of require people to go there, so to speak, in terms of their trauma and re-experiencing and kind of deeply processing the trauma that they've experienced. What MDMA in particular allows people to do is go there, but in a safe place where they're kind of they're grounded, their nervous system is regulated, they're present, they can talk about it, and they don't have that hypervigilance, they don't have that kind of autonomic kind of reactivity that people typically have when they are talking about or kind of sidling up to a traumatic memory. So it's really profoundly changing the way that some people are actually looking at the combination of the two. So we'll see how, I'm going to reserve judgment on how that's going to pan out. But there's some arguments to be made that providing some structure at the front end and the preparation and the back end and integration can be helpful, and as opposed to just being 100% kind of client directed. Yes, I'm talking about those two treatments. They're not particularly appealing to people, and what I think Steve Hayes said once, in terms of talking about training, is like, whether people want what you have is not experimental noise to be eliminated in your research design. It is the dependent variable. So people, right? People need to, people need to want what you have, and I think
Right.
psychedelics offers that.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. And I'll just kind of, note, I mean, most people know that I focus almost exclusively on ketamine due to legality. Plus, I've also found it extremely effective and have a high degree of clinical utility. It's easy to plug into a practice, for a lot of different reasons. But,
Mhm.
you just mentioned the importance of preparation and integration. And, as a person who does ketamine assisted psychotherapy, it's kind of, unimaginable sounds like a big dramatic word, but like, to not do this work with prep or without, like to do it without preparation and integration, when to me, those are such integral part of the processes, seems weird, seems
I would go and say it's unethical. I mean,
right.
I'll go out on a limb and say you're. I mean, you're really you're not just missing an opportunity. You're not giving people the benefit of the treatment that it has to offer, right? So yeah.
Well, and there's so much emphasis, with these days with, the movement, the psychedelic movement, like it's all about the medicine. And I'm just here definitively to say that it is not. And I agree with you. I was going to say the word unsophisticated, but unethical is the word that I also carry. Now, how we do that, I think, is still remains an open question.
Mhm.
But that is just a critical part of the process. And so I want to weave back to that for a second. But can you tell us about, working with veterans? Like there's always this thing, like I am not an expert at working with veterans. I do not declare myself to be an expert, but I have worked with trauma for my entire life. And then we can even get into the decision tree of trauma, developmental trauma, complex trauma,
Mhm.
specific, war trauma and event trauma, and how might those things be different, similar or different.
Mhm.
So, tell us about psychedelic work with veterans. Like, how is it? How has it been working? I guess where I'm going with this is like, what's different about it? And
Sure.
how can we ultimately really take from that to kind of, apply to the general population what you all have learned, but also develop veteran specific programming. And then, what do we need to know as practitioners? So that's a ton right there, but just
Sure, sure. Well, I'll scratch the surface there. I mean, one of the big things that distinguish veterans from other people in the population is that the shared identity, values, and culture that they
yeah.
have obtained through their military service, right? And people are probably aware it's not a soft, fuzzy kind of culture. It's pretty much like gut it out, get push through the pain to the other side of this, be strong, be independent, be resilient, and really, I mean, that's kind of the whole emphasis of the culture, and it's very well suited to warfighters, right? I mean, that's what you want. You don't want
Right.
people talking around in process groups and things like that. It's not going to happen, right?
Oh, please, we have to process this.
Yes, exactly. They stop shooting and let's do that. So that's one I think big distinguishing factor between working with veterans and working with the general population is there needs to be a deep kind of appreciation and respect for their service, much like working with other people, respect for their story, right? But it needs to come from a kind of a cultural understanding of what people have been through and understanding the kind of the context in which a trauma may have occurred, right? Because a lot of times people don't really understand, like we talk in our training about rules of engagement, right? Which are the rules under which you're supposed to engage with an enemy, right?
Yeah.
And some people in that context have hideous experiences and may do things that go against their kind of moral, ethical kind of value system, but that was what they needed to do at the time, right?
Mhm.
So I think if you go into these conversations with veterans without an appreciation of that context in which they experienced this trauma, you may pathologize them, you may personalize this, you may have a different perspective on what they've been through than you might otherwise have. Kind of riffing off that a little bit, there's a whole construct of moral injury
Mhm.
that is related to but separate from PTSD, right? And that's really when you take action that goes against some of your core values. And that can cause moral injury. And that's a real big problem in the veteran population, is because people often do have to do things in the line of service that may not align with how they see the world and how they see themselves in it. One of the challenges that we need to navigate in doing psychedelic work with veterans. A similar construct is survivor guilt. So oftentimes, well, not oftentimes, but unfortunately, more often than not, people who are in situations where they are the lone survivor or a survivor of a casualty event where some of their comrades and brothers and sisters may have been mortally injured or catastrophically disfigured or what have you. They feel terrible that they didn't do more to save that person, right? And I think some of the things that we need to focus on in therapy is helping people to appreciate, to reframe that narrative so that they are not the person who didn't do enough to save their fellow service member, right? So that's kind of another piece of what we need to focus on in terms of like how trauma manifests in this population, right? Another big piece is military sexual trauma, which is unfortunately a huge problem, and it's particularly military sexual trauma happens again in a context in which we need to understand that context, which is you may have been assaulted by a commanding officer. You may have been assaulted or harassed or otherwise victimized by somebody who is your peer and somebody you need to serve alongside. So there's a fundamental kind of violation that happens in the context of military sexual trauma that, again, viewing it through a specific veteran lens can really be helpful in understanding why that, I mean, not that sexual assault is ever not traumatic, but in this context, it's particularly challenging because people can't escape, they can't report it, they have to continue to serve with these people, and they're just really in a quite a difficult and challenging situation. So that's another kind of line of I think we need to attend to as we work with veterans, right? Another big piece, and we can move on, but another big piece is readjustment. So veterans and people who come out of the service often have real challenges around readjusting to civilian life, right? So that's another kind of piece of the context we need to understand when we work with veterans in psychedelics is that some of their challenges may be coming from the fact that they've lost their sense of meaning and purpose, which used to be kind of occupied by their military service, right? Serving with their brothers and sisters, their fellow service members, right? And having an identity and a purpose and values, and then all that goes away. So that is a real challenge for veterans in terms of reconnecting with people in the community. I think we'll get into it, but I think that's one of the reasons why peer support is so valuable, because then the veteran who is doing the psychedelic work is working with somebody who understands what that is like, what their experience was like. So it's interesting. I work with most of the people at Heroic Hearts are veterans. I'm not a veteran myself, but so I have a lot to learn from them, and that's, and I'll close by that, it's like, I often, when I work with veterans, my attitude is very much like, teach me. Like, I don't, it's a very different kind of power dynamic than a typical kind of, and I don't mean to overgeneralize, but there can be a power differential between therapist and client. And I try to close that up using humility, using an invitation to kind of educate me about their story and their particular challenges, right? And I think that can be, and again, educate me about military service and the values, cultural identities, specific manifestations of trauma in that population is really a kind of that's kind of the foundation on which all of this work needs to happen. And to be honest, as a civilian, as a non-veteran, it's harder. It's a lot harder than being a veteran because I'm not in the club. I mean, that's the truth of the matter, right? And so I can kind of be a fellow traveler. I can support them, but I'm not, and I never represent myself as having any military experience or even really deeply understanding what military service is all about because I've never been there myself,
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I took some notes. You mentioned just PTSD, not just, but standard, more standard PTSD, being involved in like horrific situations, moral injury, survivor guilt, military sexual trauma, and then the readjustment trauma. And the thing that came up for me as you were talking is it's like, the first chunk of them are about like so much often about having to go back into the context and all the different power structures that exist in that. And, that you're just expected to just function and go about your business and just keep going. into the same thing. And I know that's a gross generalization, but then I thought when you talked about readjustment and the lack of identity, then it's almost like the opposite, like the lack of context.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's people are feel adrift, right? I mean, they
Mhm.
have the military. It's a very structured, directive environment, so people know what to do because somebody often tells them what to do. Well, now you
Mhm.
remove that whole structure, and people are like, "What do I do next? Like, where do I
Yeah,
go? How do I get what I need?" Right? It's a very
right.
challenging transition.
Yeah. And you mentioned, and then I want to talk about peer support. You mentioned, that oftentimes for survivor guilt, and specifically, you mentioned it's about changing the narrative from the person who didn't do enough to something else. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts clinically in terms of the therapy side of things, because we're gonna, I want to ask you about like therapy versus peer support in this
Hmm.
population.
Hmm.
But, as clinicians, because there's a lot of us who do some work with veterans, not enough, again, to claim expertise. And I hear you about just being a fellow traveler, like never stepping in and claiming that you know more than you actually do. Um, but, tips on that, like reframing the story or other things that might be kind of unique, specific types of clinical tools to utilize with veteran populations. Any thoughts on that? And again, that can be in psychedelics or not.
Yeah, from a non, I mean, for the evidence-based trauma-focused therapies like cognitive processing and prolonged exposure, I always encourage people don't throw the baby out with the bathwater because
Mm,
cognitive processing therapy in particular is all about identifying that core belief that's keeping you stuck.
yeah.
It's your stuck point, right? And so that core belief may well be around survivor guilt. So you can
Mm,
kind of come at it with that frame and draw from all the strategies and techniques that have been developed as part of CPT to apply those in the context of doing psychedelic therapy with somebody, right? But it's like the whole principle of like approaching that which you have avoided historically, that's pretty valid. And there's a ton of data to suggest that that's what you need to do, right? So, I mean, there's some universals around kind of trauma treatment that I think apply to veterans as well. But looking at core beliefs around survivor guilt, for example, and using the kind of, I don't want to use the word technology, but using the strategies, techniques, and approach from like a CPT perspective can be super helpful, right? So, I encourage people. There's kind of I've encountered an attitude in the psychedelic community that we just reject all of these other things and we know
right.
better and we know. And I think that's a mistake. And to be honest, I think that's one of the things that clinicians bring to the table that coaches may not, because you understand all these other techniques. I mean, I was like most people, I'm an eclectic integrationist, right? I'm drawing from mindfulness-based traditions. I'm drawing from cognitive behavioral therapy, drawing from acceptance-based therapy, right? And putting all those together to help that individual client who I'm sitting with, right? And I think that's one of the things that clinicians have. They have a much larger toolbox or bag of tricks than
Mhm.
people who have not received like advanced clinical training and understand some of the different approaches, because again, like let's not just dismiss all of this tremendous work that's happened over the years. Let's figure out we can align it with the way that we do psychedelic work, right?
Mhm. Well, and I would say, from my perspective and, supporting clinicians and learning how to utilize the psychedelic space, again, specific to ketamine, but is that those core beliefs will often emerge. And, naming them like during a medicine session or during preparation. And then I think that there's a skill set in how to kind of name it and be with it and kind of join with it that is different than what I would be doing in traditional psychotherapy. And yet there is powerful, indications that once it emerges, then I think clients can often see it differently in the medicine session. And then we can carry that through in integration.
Yeah,
Um,
it kind of gets people unstuck, right? I mean, you talk about stuck points in CPT, and I mean, it's definitely a powerful way to get you out of
yeah.
your rut. And
Yeah.
think about things in a different, hopefully more charitable, compassionate light, in terms of your own role in things and your kind of experience.
Yeah, well, I love what you just said about don't let's not throw out all that we already know, because that is not my perspective at all. My perspective is like let's bring in what we already know and kind of morph it with the added benefit of the non-ordinary state with the medicine and kind of figure out how those things morph together so that we can do really potent integration that
Yeah.
is meaningful.
I agree. I agree. And again, you have like having been in graduate school for a long time as we have, you pick up a lot of useful
Yes.
skills, you know? It's like, I mean, you're not starting from ground zero and basing everything on your experience in the psychedelic space. You have a long history of working successfully with clients using all these different modalities, all these different therapeutic orientations and approaches. And you don't throw that away when you sit with a client in I mean, you may hold that back when you're sitting in medicine with a client, right? Where you're
Yeah.
just attuned and present and holding space, right? But in the prep and integration, portions of the show, these things can be super helpful. And I think that's one of the reasons, one of the ways in which having a clinical background can really give you a leg up on a person who has, their 150 hours of didactics and a 40-hour practicum and call themselves a facilitator, right?
Right. It's an interesting thing. Like, and you're writing a training curriculum for that. So I'm curious because I do train clinicians and I see what I'm doing as clinical work. And I
Mhm.
see it as fundamentally building on the skill set that I already have, and which frames how I see it and the choice of intervention that I use. And yet it's also a gatekeeper. Like, is it the right thing to do to say, oh, well, a degree is necessary in order to do this work? And I would say no, and yet it's also really value added. So I don't profess to have the answer to those questions, but I think they're important questions to just be curious about.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, one of the things that in the heroic arts work, our coaches and facilitators are veteran peers, right? So they
Mm.
have what we were just talking about previously. They have that perspective, which is hugely valuable that I don't have, right? So
Right.
there's a trade-off here. And I think, I mean, for me, a lot of it comes down to scope of practice, right? Like what's in a coach's scope of practice, what's in a facilitator's scope of practice, what's in a clinician's scope of practice, right?
Yeah.
And there's a fair amount of overlap across those different roles. But there's also a fair amount of kind of unique variance, right? That's
Yeah.
accountable for by in those different roles, right? So I would say that the fundamentals that we train coaches, veteran peer coaches, and facilitators are the same things we would train a clinician to do in terms of their basic like skills, like deep listening,
Mhm.
selective listening, active listening. That whole approach of being like client centered and allowing people to go where they need to go, right? But I think we also have our scope includes, as clinicians, includes addressing bona fide mental health issues and
Mhm.
psychiatric diagnoses and things, which I think, as you know, well, you're a trauma therapist, I mean, stuff comes up that is very difficult to deal with. And if you don't have the experience of sitting with people and helping guide them through those experiences, I think that gives you're not perhaps as well positioned to help somebody with more severe kind of psychiatric, psychological, mental health kind of issues.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. So, I mean, so that brings us to this piece about peer support. You've emphasized throughout the time we've been talking about how important that is for veterans.
Mhm.
And so tell us just like a couple sentences about what Hearts Project is. I happen to have a booth next to Heroic Hearts at Psychedelic Science, so I talked a lot to the people and
Sure.
just really think it's a beautiful mission. But if you could say that, and then let's just talk about peer support, and again, maybe even then kind of in the broader coaching and what's gained and what's lost by not having therapists. So let's
Yeah,
just.
yeah, for sure. For sure. Let me give you a little history on Hearts because folks might not be familiar with our organization, but we were started back in 2017. Our founder and president, Jesse Gould, was an Army Ranger who was having really significant PTSD problems, reintegration problems after his discharge. And he was wandering the world looking for, he had been an investment banker. He
Mm,
kind of walked away from that whole career in search of kind of healing from the trauma that he experienced. And he ended up sitting in ceremony with the Shipibo people in Peru, in the jungles of Peru, and
mm,
found healing, deep and profound healing for himself, and took it upon himself to make it his mission to provide as many veterans as possible access to that same healing experience as he had.
mm.
And so what they did is set up a system that's grown dramatically over the past, even this is 2017, so whatever, number of years, that they have set up a system and process that allows us to, I think last year we had 25 retreats, 25 international retreats. It was
Wow.
pretty significant, right?
That's a lot.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. And
And is it all using psilocybin
no,
or
man,
moving into
those are
other plant
international
medicines?
retreats. Those are
Okay.
international retreats that use a variety of different medicines, primarily ayahuasca, also
Mm,
ibogaine, also psilocybin.
mm,
Yeah, so those are the kind of and ibogaine,
mm.
which is a really helpful for treating addiction, as you know. But yeah, so it was started as a bootstrap operation. It's
Mhm.
still a small but mighty team, and we have the operations people are just outstanding in terms of like getting people to these retreats, like screening them, making sure that they're safe, getting them there and back. And that's much of, again, of the vast majority of the money that we raise goes to sending veterans to these retreats, right? So
Mhm.
what we're doing now, though, is developing, as we kind of mentioned, a training program here in the States, primarily in Oregon, where we're going to be training people to become facilitators, right? And so the way Heroic Hearts is set up is that participants who go on an international retreat or soon domestic retreats and are excited about their healing and want to give back to their fellow veterans have an opportunity to become a coach. So that's a veteran
Mhm.
peer who is not a facilitator. They work exclusively in the preparation and integration phases. Sorry about that. One sec. We'll have to cut that out.
Okay.
Hold on one sec. Um, yeah. So hopefully she'll stop. Um, yes. So yes, so they are to back up.
Mhm.
Coaches are veteran peers who are trained through Heroic Hearts to primarily support the preparation, but really the integration phase of the work. And that's, as we kind of alluded to, that's often a missing piece in
Yeah.
kind of psychedelic kind of continuum of care, right? So the way we work is a participant who's excited about becoming a coach has to wait for a year to
Yeah.
integrate and integrate their experience and work on themselves, do their own
Nice.
work, right?
Okay.
That's another interesting distinction between kind of therapists and coaches and facilitators is like coaches and facilitators, like working on yourself, doing the work is such a critical piece. And at least in my clinical training, that was not a big piece.
Yeah.
That's I think not that many of us have do the work right ourselves, but that's not a requirement. So participants then can become coaches. They work on the prep and integration end of things, and then coaches can go on to become facilitators by engaging in one of these training programs, right? So it's kind
Yeah.
of like a natural evolution of people. The peer is the person who's been through this, like the military experience and the psychedelic experience, right? And then they move on to coaching others in the integration space, and then they move on to doing the medicine work. That's the big distinction for us
Okay. So there's
between.
multiple steps.
Yes, ma'am.
So.
Yeah, becoming a facilitator, the facilitator does the medicine work, right?
Mm,
And the coaches do not. That's the biggest distinction between the two.
mm.
But you can see there's kind of a natural progression and kind of upskilling at each stage as people journey from their own personal work to helping facilitate other people in the medicine space.
That's so interesting because you raised one specific point that almost everyone on this show has ever raised, which is people needing to do their own work, like, with the medicine, which is a huge part of Living Medicine Institute training, but also their own personal work. So that piece about the year for integration and just like letting that percolate and making certain that you're not just like, I have seen the light and now I wish to teach you all the things,
Yes.
like
Yes,
that.
we put the brakes on that. We also have some
Yeah.
gates between the different phases, right? So not all participants who express interest in becoming coaches are well suited to become coaches. And
Mm,
Heroic Arts is not shy about saying, no, we're not going to take your money. We're not going to advance you. This is,
mm,
we do things like assess people's kind of emotional intelligence, their empathy, their,
yeah.
kind of those non-specific, those common factors that are so difficult to train. I mean,
Yeah.
I've kind of learned that the hard way. You can't train people to become empathetic.
Not at our age.
Something you
Not at
got or something you,
point. Not at a certain
so,
point, right?
yeah,
I
yeah.
think, like that's like whether or not you can train it when they're young remains open. But I think once you become solidified, it's pretty hard.
once you get to the grad school stage. But even and then there's a gap between coaches and facilitators, right?
Yeah.
Where we give people tests and we interview them and we make sure that they're going to be successful in
Yeah.
their facilitation work. And not everybody makes it through. And I think that's one of the key distinctions between like Heroic Hearts and some of the other, the for-profit kind of psilocybin training programs, which if
Right.
you've got a check, you're welcome to join us and we'll get you through, right? And that's
Oh, that's actually, I was just thinking that. That's huge, actually. Like, if you all are willing to say no, and that this is not, you're not just a for-profit entity, and that's a really big deal because not everybody is suited. Like, let's just name that again. Not everybody is suited for that work. And that doesn't mean that they're good nor bad nor anything. It just
yeah,
means that there are some characteristics that go along with an affinity to do this work. Like, I'm not an engineer. Like I can appreciate engineering. I can like really value that. And
sure.
I don't have that. I don't have that capacity. So it's important.
No, and we can't all we don't want to be master of none, and right, and
Right. No, it's really good. So I'm curious where you think, ketamine fits into all of this. Like, so, I mean, I don't mean to kind of completely veer off into like a totally different direction because it sounds like you all are doing like a great, you're developing a great training program and with a great deal of intention, and I love that. And I'm still kind of curious about the dual role of the kind of therapist versus peer support, what's gained, what's like what might be lost. But then I'm
mhm.
also just curious about ketamine, and I'm aware of the time. We don't have a ton of time, so I'm just curious what your thoughts are about
I
any of
think
those things.
I think it's a valuable tool in the toolbox. I mean,
Mhm.
the medicines. There's a Our course doesn't just talk about psilocybin. It talks about the
Yeah.
whole range of medicines, classic
Mhm.
psychedelics and pathogens and pathogens. Dissociative anesthetics like ketamine. And I think they all. My colleague and friend Jared Reinhardt, who is our head of integration coaching, talks about the different energies that
Mhm.
medicines have and
Oh,
bring.
uh-huh.
And I think that I'm more. It's interesting. We give presentations, and I'm more of the establishment scientist, kind of Western medicine guy,
Yeah.
and he's much more of the indigenous practice, kind of deep facilitation kind of work. So I think to your question, Sandy, about the ketamine versus other medicines, I think one of the things I've learned from my colleagues at Heroic Hearts is that medicines can have different kind of energetic signatures, and they
Yeah.
can be helpful for different people in different places at different times, right? So I
Yeah.
think it's kind of one of the tools that we have available to us. It's one of the medicines in addition to the natural medicines or some of the synthetic medicines. And I think I'm not a ketamine assisted therapist, but I can play one on TV. I know enough to understand that how different in many ways the medicine session is from a classic psychedelic session, or even when people are doing like a lower dose or like a microdose or a cyclitic kind of approach to doing the facilitation work. It's very different. I mean, as you well know, people
Right.
dissociate and they kind of go away, and you're sitting there holding space for them, but they're kind of somewhere else. And so
I
I
beg
think,
to differ.
all
I have
right,
to
well,
call
fair.
flag
Like I
on
said,
that play.
yes, please go correct me. I'm always wanted to learn new things.
I will just say that the difference between doing ketamine assisted psychotherapy with a therapist that you have done preparation with, this idea that the person goes somewhere else and they don't want to talk is just false. Like, I'm not saying you are
Okay.
false. I apologize, but I always kind of
No,
want to
no,
put because I get the
I
ask that.
stand, I stand, I stand corrected, and I base it on my personal experience of ketamine assisted therapy, and that was my experience. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. But thank you for helping me see that others have different experiences.
Yeah, well, if you were working with a therapist and you still didn't want to talk, then I would say that may have been a dosing issue. But a lot of times when people do ketamine treatment alone, they're like, I wouldn't want to talk during that. And I was like, I just think if you have the context of that,
Mhm.
you went in with that being the thing. But again, not to belabor that too much.
No, no. Well, I think it has its value, but I mean, I can't, not being a ketamine assisted therapist, I can't speak to how the affordances of ketamine as compared to more classic psychedelics that
Sure.
I'm more familiar with.
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of let's finish up by kind of that piece about therapist, what's gained, what's lost in the therapist, and how important is training? And I'll kind of emphasize the latter one just because from my lens, in that therapists can jump into this work, specifically with ketamine without any training, and there is no requirement. And I personally think that it is of critical importance to get some training and have some experience with the medicine. And, more may be better. That's certainly my
Mhm.
lens, but I leave that one open for discussion. But, what are your thoughts on this? The importance of training, therapists versus coaches, those kinds of things. Like as you're busy writing a training manual
Sure,
and
sure.
a book kind of that has therapist and coach editions, like what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think that so one piece that you mentioned first that I want to amplify and kind of expand upon is the importance of experiential training, right? I think
Mhm.
that people who have not gone through, don't have, some my storied history of psychedelic exploration in my youth, or people who don't understand what it's like to be in an altered state of consciousness have no business doing this work, in my opinion, right? So I think that's like a critical piece of it. And the way that different training programs approach that experiential component are very different, right? And I think we don't know how best to support, like, what is the best form of a practicum? You know what I mean? Like a large group, small group, individual. We can't really do individual, but so anyway, that's a whole domain that I think is still evolving, is like how people are doing and their own experience, and then connecting that to holding space for other people, right? So
Yeah.
that's I think that's a really helpful kind of reminder. So I think speaking to the coach therapist distinction, I think we've
Yeah.
touched on that in a number of places in our
Yeah.
conversation today. I think it comes down to scope of practice. I think the
Mm,
scope of practice of clinicians is more broad, so as to include people who have some more significant kind of mental health or cognitive issues. So that's an important piece of it. And I think that therapists can draw from a much deeper experience in terms of helping people work through their issues and difficulties and work through their trauma, etc. So I think they bring additional tools that coaches don't have. And they may
mm,
not have that peer experience, but I think it's more than offset by their expertise that they can bring to bear.
yeah. Well, it's interesting because it's just again like, one of the things that comes up, for us in training you know, is being a really good therapist enough to do good psychedelic work? Is being a good therapist with no experience with the medicine enough to do psychedelic work? What about really gifted underground facilitators? Most states it's still underground. And where's the place for them? And we don't want to
Right.
gatekeep those people out either, who are essentially the wisdom keepers for this field, but we don't have
Sure.
kind of an accepted. And then there's lots of therapists who are just okay, right? And how do we compare
Sure,
those
sure.
to kind of a peer
Yeah,
support coaching model? So it's just an
yeah.
interesting thing.
Yeah, one observation I just make in my own experience is that in some way, like doing the medicine work itself requires you to unlearn some of your
Oh yeah.
psychotherapeutic clinicals or not apply them in that context, right? So I was trained as an old school CBT therapist, so I'm like all about talking and collaborating and partnering. And it's like, wait, right? Why am I talking? Step back, let the
Mhm.
process unfold. And that's that, and hold space and regulate your nervous system and ground and all these things. And that's very different for me than the way I typically operate in psychotherapy. So it's required me to kind of unlearn some things that a facilitator may be much more expert at, right? So there's
Right.
some advantages of those underground people or who have done this work for a long time, the wisdom keepers, as you say, the medicine carriers. They have an incredibly valuable perspective that's different from mine, but they're not orthogonal. They're complementary, I think, and
Right.
that's as it should be.
Yeah, I used to do, some people know this, but I used to do staff training for direct care staff and outdoor-based therapeutic programs and also some residential treatment centers. And that's very much
Cool.
a peer model. Like you're out there in the field. And, from my impression, those were the people that were really doing the bulk of the work. And then therapists would come in and really, and, I have a kind of a bias towards the team approach. I don't know, hopefully and that can naturally emerge, I think, in, the psychedelic therapy world. So, um,
Well, it does in the coaching that we do in heroic hearts. It definitely does emerge in that context, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where people
Mm-hmm.
can people kind of bring their experience, but there's the role for the therapist, there's a role for a coach, and again, they kind of complement one another, and we just
Right.
have to figure out where those boundaries are and kind of respect those, right? I mean, and figure out when am I operating out of scope, when am I in scope, and I just find that a useful kind of heuristic in terms of understanding what we're good at and what other people might be better at.
Yeah. All right. So here's the kind of last kind of broad thing. So what have we missed? What would you love to share? Where would you like to see the field go to? How do you want to kind of bring this to a close? Like what is important for you to share in this moment?
I think it's the importance of integration. That's where I would
Okay.
land. And it's fitting that this is the end of our conversation today, right? But it's
Yeah.
like let's figure out how to help people provide the emotional psychological support, active listening, empathy, meaning making, right? That's like again, we were talking about kind of decontextualizing the psychedelic work and not having it situated in the course of therapy or kind of ongoing work. And without that, we're kind of lost. It's a missed
Mhm.
opportunity. Let's put it that way. It's much like,
Yeah.
people get dropped into a ketamine session and then they just go home. And it's
Yeah.
like, well, no. I mean, there's all these opportunities for growth and meaning making and self-reflection and building agency. And so that's really where Heroic Hearts, I think, shines is the integration coaching kind of system and people and it is a system. It's not just, and that's another point I'd leave our listeners with is
Mhm.
that there's this happens in community, and
Yeah.
to the extent that the coach, we have a community of integration coaches who work with and support one another and consult one another, et cetera. Right. So it's not just we're going to drop people off at the end of the process. We're going to
Mm.
develop a whole community of people who can support people in terms of ongoing engagement, ongoing. I had an interesting conversation recently about whether integration does it end, right? Because some people feel like it's kind of an open-ended process, and others feel like there's a beginning, middle, and end to the integration piece too. And I'm open to both perspectives. I kind of come to it from a there's the former perspective is very much aligned with substance use recovery, right?
Yeah.
Substance abuse recovery, which is like you're always in recovery, you're never recovered, right? So the
Right.
question becomes, are you always integrating from that experience? And there's an argument to be made that yes, it's a lifelong process, and let's keep going, and let's do that in community with other people who are doing similar work. I think that can be incredibly powerful.
Well, and that I would say is just one of the kind of lost pieces too, actually, in the ketamine work and in a lot of psychedelic work is like, okay, well, you had your integration session and, would you like to continue?
Yeah,
And really ideally, non-ordinary states of consciousness experiences. I have a clear bias towards this of all sorts, whether they be wilderness or deep meditation or, any number of dance, music, movement, breathing. There's an ongoing process about the way that it all unfolds. So I
yeah. Well,
appreciate
and it's just
bringing that
lasts as long as you're alive, right? I mean, it keeps going, and I think multiple psychedelic experiences can kind of give you more fodder for integration, not just that specific experience and those specific realizations you have about self or ego loss or whatever. I mean, it's about the cumulative effect of these things and how they change your perspective on your life and your way of being in the world. And I think that's why multiple psychedelic experiences can be kind of build upon one another and help people give them more fodder for integration, which I think is kind of it's the capstone experience of the psychedelic kind of therapy, right? And I think that you can do that in community with like-minded others. You can do it in an integration circle. You can do it with your psychotherapist, but or all of these things, which would be
right.
ideal.
I can't. I'm just grinning because I'm like, once again, it all comes back to the Grateful Dead lot.
Yeah, yeah, right. It does, doesn't it? For some of
For
us, yes,
some
yes.
of us,
It,
this
it's
is
all it's all
where,
about community. And yes, I appreciate you bringing it back to that. It is
right,
like-minded people kind of journeying together, being connected to
right.
one another, and trying to make meaning out of their experience and kind of use those experiences to improve their life and the lives of other people around them.
Totally. Well, that is a beautiful ending point. So, Ken, I really appreciate your time and you sharing your wisdom and your expertise. And I know people are going to find this useful. And so, thank you again. So, we're very much appreciate.
Thank you so much, Danny, for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Living Medicine. We'll see you again next time. Be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.